Hello dear friends, the book reading project is now starting, as I announced, with the second half of the chapter Beliefs and Ethics. We have read last Saturday the first 7, or it was more, I think 7 or 8 pages, and let me try a little bit to show also the flowers. And we will start with sitting practice, 15 minutes, and you're invited to stay with me, or you attend and join me a quarter of an hour later, which would be also fine. So Hello, good morning or good afternoon, dear friends. I'm glad to see some names, or one name which is familiar to me. Hello, Lynn, and greetings to the others. Please let me have one sip before I read for a longer time. In case you were here last Saturday or have perhaps listened to the YouTube film, the last sentence of the last reading from the book What is Zen? Plain Talk for a Beginner's Mind was as follows. On page 67, in case you have the book at home. It is the last chapter on the page 67. But we do know how to accept, endure, and go forth to make use of what happens for our path. That's awakening. That's freedom. The name of the chapter is Beliefs and Ethics. So I'm now going on with a question Susan Moon is putting. I know that good karma is connected to keeping the precepts. So what are the precepts? Can you give us a quick review? And Norman Fischer answers. Yes, in Zen, as in all forms of Buddhism, precepts are an attempt to prescribe good and bad conduct. Conduct that defines positive and negative karma. Of course, in real life, what happens is always more challenging than a simple set of rules for conduct can ever cover. But precepts are a start, and our ongoing study of them, as we live through a life in which many good and bad things happen and in which we make many mistakes, continually deepens our sense of karma and focuses our conduct. In our Soto Zen tradition, we follow a precepts tradition created by Dogen. His precepts list includes 16 Bodhisattva precepts, that is, precepts for practitioners who want to practice the Bodhisattva path of compassion and concern for everyone and everything. Dogen's precepts draw on other precept lists from earlier Buddhism. The 16 are divided into 3 subsets. The first set is the Triple Refuge, or Refuge in the Triple Treasure, the oldest of all Buddhist commitments. The Buddha, the teacher, Dharma, the teaching, and Sangha, the community. I take refuge in Buddha. I take refuge in Dharma. I take refuge in Sangha. Refuge means literally to fly back, to return to commit oneself to what is already a deep natural urge of the heart. These 3 precepts are understood both in the narrowest sense. In brackets, the Buddha as the historical founder of Buddhism, the Dharma as the Buddhist scriptures, the Sangha as the Buddhist community. And the widest sense, in brackets again, the Buddha within all beings, the way of life that respects and loves everyone, the community of all beings. These 3 commitments are the foundation of all the other precepts. To receive and cherish them is to begin our precepts practice by returning to our most fundamental nature, our inherent desire to be good, and to identify with the best that is in us and with everything. The next set is the 3 pure precepts, the broadest sense of inspired conduct beyond particulars. They express the wish to act always for the good, avoiding what is harmful for oneself and others, and performing beneficial actions for oneself and others, and doing this with a feeling of including others in kindness. I vow to avoid harmful conduct. I vow to do beneficial conduct. I vow to live for and with all beings. The third and final set is the 10 prohibitive precepts, which in our groups we also state as the 10 clear mind precepts, the positive side of the 10 prohibitions. These precepts attempt to define specific areas of conduct to be encouraged when stated in the positive sense, and prohibited when stated in the negative sense. I vow to protect life, not to kill. I vow to receive gifts, not to steal. I vow to respect others, not to misuse sexuality. I vow to be truthful, not to lie. I vow to maintain clarity, not to intoxicate self or others. I vow to speak kindly, not to speak ill of others. I vow to maintain modesty, not to praise self at the expense of others. I vow to be generous, not to be possessive of anything. I vow to be loving, not to harbor ill will. I vow to cherish and polish the 3 treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Traditionally, the precepts are studied and practiced on 3 levels. The levels are called by various names, but let's call them literal, compassionate, and absolute. On the literal level, you do your best to follow the precept, not killing, not stealing, not lying. On the compassionate level, you focus more on the motivation of compassion than on the letter of the law. So sometimes compassion might dictate that you lie to save someone's life, or steal when there is an urgent need to do so to benefit others. On the absolute level, the level of emptiness, non-difference, and ultimate reality, you can't keep or break any precept. You can't kill. Life always keeps on going. There is nothing that can be killed. And you can't not kill. Your life, in order to continue, inevitably supplants other lives, plants, insects, bacteria, and so on. In practicing precepts, all 3 levels, which are one reality conceptually discussed as 3, are always in operation. So conduct is never simple or one-dimensional. And yet we do try to keep precepts and to keep them better and better as wisdom and experience increase. One consequence of the rich complexity of precept practice is that the more you practice, the more difficult it becomes to feel morally certain or superior. We can never feel we are keeping precepts perfectly, or that someone else is definitely breaking precepts. We can watch our own conduct, and question the conduct of others when appropriate, but never with self-rightedness. Condemnation of self or others begins to seem impossible. Susan Moon Sensei asks, so how important is it for a Zen student to study the precepts or ethical conduct in light of all those stories about Zen masters whacking their students and chopping cats in two? It doesn't seem like their main goal was to act ethically, but rather to blow people's minds, to help us break through our limited views of ourselves. And Norman Fischer Roshi answers, this question is important because it reflects an important change that has occurred in the Western Zen community over the last 50 or so years. As I said, Zen was first introduced to the West from Japan. For many cultural reasons, morality and precepts weren't emphasized in the Japanese Zen that was initially transmitted. There were important precepts ceremonies, but they were simply done as ritual, without much discussion or reflection about the precepts themselves. D.T. Suzuki was much more interested in his English language writings in the metaphysics of Zen than he was in ethics. Alan Watts was also disinclined to emphasize ethics. Suzuki Roshi and Maezumi Roshi were mainly trying to encourage young people to do Zazen. So the early pioneers didn't emphasize precepts. Besides, it was the 1960s when conventional ethics preached the evils of drugs, sex and rock and roll, the cornerstones of the generation of people who were interested in Zen. For them, large ethical concerns like peace and justice, which seemed to them to be lacking in our society, were salient. The personal ethics of restraint seemed far less important. Maybe they were even suspect. But by the 1980s, this had changed drastically, and by now it is typical in Zen communities that students study and reflect on the 16 Bodhisattva precepts that are taken in all commitment ceremonies. Now, both global and personal ethical concerns are considered part of precept practice, and precept practice is considered central to Zen. In fact, this is something Dogen taught, but from the 1980s on, we began focusing on these teachings much more than we had before. It is true that Zen practice emphasizes seeing beyond constrictive views to a wider, broader, deeper, and freer sense of reality. But this doesn't necessarily involve what you'd call blowing someone's mind. The idea that Zen is supposed to destroy your logical mind while catapulting you into some exalted state of intuitive irrationality is overdone, probably under the influence of D.T. Suzuki, who seemed to be saying this, and the many others following him who repeated it. Suzuki was very much aware of Western culture and its predisposition to rationality and materialism, and he was also aware that contemporary Western philosophy was beginning to question this. He wanted to startle Westerners into appreciating the contrast between their way of looking at things and Zen's, and he seemed to have an intuitive sense that emphasizing irrationality and mystical freedom would strongly appeal, as it did. The truth is, Zen is reasonable in its own way. There is a teaching, a practice, a method. Throughout its history, Zen has been almost the opposite of irrationality, and unconventionality. All those stick-wielding classical Chinese masters depicted in the stories were celibate monastics, maintaining precepts and living according to strict monastic deportment. Some of their more drastic stories, like Hui Ko cutting off his arm in order to study with Bodhidharma, or Nan Shi Yuan's cutting a cat in two, are probably apocryphal and were understood to be so throughout the centuries, although the idea of making great sacrifices in order to pursue the way of Zen was often emphasized, perhaps more than we would feel comfortable with today. And corporal punishment was commonplace in ancient times in most cultures, and was in ours too, until a generation or two ago. Susan. There's a lot of overlap between the 10 Commandments of Judaism and Christianity and the 10 grave precepts of Zen Buddhism. For example, both tell us not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to commit adultery. Are they basically the same value system? Does a good Christian or Jew act the same as a good Zen Buddhist? Norman. I think a good Jew or Christian who follows the 10 Commandments isn't much different from a precept-keeping Zen person, though in some ways the understanding of what one is doing in following commandments or precepts could differ. The Christian might feel commanded by God to be just and righteous, and might feel God's displeasure if there are infractions. The Zen person would probably be focused more on his or her conduct for its own sake, and would probably be just as focused on thoughts and feelings as on actions. Just as the 16 Bodhisattva precepts begin with the 3 refuges, the 10 Commandments begin with a commitment to God. That is, both begin with a commitment to some